Great. Well, it's about 7:30, and so we'll go ahead and get started. I am thrilled. I want to welcome everybody to the second night tonight in a series that we're doing on supporting the mental well-being of children and adolescents. My name is Janet Hatfield LeGros. I'm one of the pastors here at First Presbyterian Church, and tonight we're going to focus on adolescence. And it is my great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and have Joseph Allen with us. And yes, Joe is married to last night's speaker. So they are, Claudia and Joe are an incredible pair. Joe is a psychologist at UVA, and I'll share more about Joe in a second. But let's begin with prayer. Let us pray. Dear God, source of love and life, thank you for this day we have been given and the chance to be together, to talk and to learn. Our hearts and minds are focused on young people and the heavy burden, especially that they're carrying now through this long period of isolation. Help us tonight to focus our attention on them, on their struggles and their strengths. We pray for every teenager, every young adult, for their health and growth and safety. And we pray for all parents. Help us as a community to be a place of safety and support, of compassion and affirmation. Open our hearts and minds to listen and to learn. We pray in your holy name. Amen. So welcome again to everybody. This whole series is really meant for us to support families and parents, especially parents and grandparents and teachers who are trying to support children and adolescents. So Joe, I'm so grateful that you're here with us. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction, but then Joe will share some about his work in a little bit. So Joseph Allen is the Hugh P. Kelly Professor of Psychology at the University of Virginia. His research focuses on adolescent social development, family and peer relationships, problematic behaviors ranging from delinquency and teen pregnancy to depression and anxiety. And he also does long-term studies, longitudinal studies on predictive and long-term outcomes into adulthood. And he's actually in year 21 of a 30-year study on some of these topics. Joe runs the Adolescent Research Lab at UVA, and I want to tell you that the website for the Adolescent Research Lab is wonderful. So that's a great place to visit and to do some learning about his research. And one of my favorite aspects of Joe's work is he's developed a program both for high schools and now particularly for university students. And at UVA, it's called the Connections Project. And it's a small group project for first-year students to help them to build deep relationships, maybe deeper and more meaningful relationships than they might get in other parts of their life in the university, and as a support for one another. And I was so fortunate, Joe, to be a part of a pilot group years ago with high school students as Joe was developing that program. So I'd love to hear more about it and how things are going. And as I said last night, Joe and his wife Claudia are the parents of 3 grown children and friends of my children. And so I can personally attest to your wise counsel, Joe, in my own life and in the life of many people I know. So thank you again for being here. And I'm going to start off the same way I did last night and just ask you to share anything about your current work, what you're working on, what's interesting to you, what you're discovering in your research or clinical practice.
Well, sure. Well, thank you, Janet, and thank you for such a nice introduction. Those were super sweet words, and yes, you've actually been a significant part of the project. That's the thing I'm most interested in right now. So I have two major foci in my research currently. One is the Connection Project, which you mentioned, where the best way to describe that is if you were lucky in high school or college, at some point you found yourself falling into a group of other young people where, for whatever reason, it felt safe enough that you started to let down your guard. And you realized, whoa, everybody else shares the same uncertainties and hopes and fears that I do. And when you share that, people bond really quickly and you form strong, lasting relationships. I've said, I just was speaking last week with my best friend from high school, and we've stayed in touch, many, many years later. But that's if you're lucky. It happens randomly. It happens in theater troupes, it happens in retreats, it happens in wilderness experiences, but for a lot of kids, it doesn't happen. So we spent a good 5 years saying, what are the ingredients that make this happen? And how can we begin to replicate them? And it's a matter of helping kids feel, and this will lead into my answer to some of your questions. I think it's a matter of helping kids feel safe and recognizing that the things they're worried about, that other people are worried about too, which is something that teenagers don't necessarily recognize. So it's a semester-long project. Janet, you were really instrumental as we were developing this for high school students, and help. There are elements of the project that are really directly from you still. So it's been used in high schools. It's now being replicated nationally. It's being used at UVA now for a couple of years, and it's sort of growing by leaps and bounds. And we're finding that kids who are in it not only feel more of a sense of belonging and connection, they feel less depressed, they feel more academically engaged. It's good for us in a whole bunch of ways. And that's related to the longitudinal study that we've done. We're interested not in what makes a good adolescence, but what is in adolescence that makes for a good adulthood. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we've been looking at lately is physical health. And what we're finding is that the quality of your peer relationships as early as age 13, and even as your best friend might describe them, predicts your physical health well into adulthood, and even your physical health and things that we can measure in the blood and that we can measure in aspects of your genome and your epigenome. And that fits with sort of a big body of studies that's shown that your social relationship quality, if it's not good, actually has more of an impact on your health and your likelihood even of dying than things like cigarette smoking or heavy drinking or obesity. That we're social beings, and adolescents in particular are social beings. And I'll stop there because I think that probably leads into my answer to a bunch of questions you're going to have.
Yes, I have a bunch of questions to ask. And actually, I want to say one thing before I ask the question. And I forgot to tell people that we've been gathering questions from parents to be able to ask Joe tonight. And if you have a question tonight, we've discovered the only way to add them tonight is in the comments section on YouTube, but please go ahead and do that if we're talking and you have a question. And Brick, who's here in the background helping us with IT things, he'll forward that question to me, and we'll try to get to it. But I am really interested when you talked about all the implications of social relationships, and I have a bunch of questions about that. But the first is really around loneliness, because, and I guess I'll ask both questions. One is just if you could speak to loneliness. I think that's something that we feel a lot of young people are experiencing right now, both in high school and college. And my second question is, as a parent, how do you tell the difference between loneliness and just you have an introverted child who's solitary, who likes to be alone, and how do we, okay, here's question number 3 too, and I'll remind you of them, but when as a parent do you respect their desire to be alone, or their seeming desire to be alone? And when do you push them toward social relationships and how to do that? All right, I'm going to stop.
Okay, well, that'll cover our first hour, right? So first thing, and it's not that well recognized, and it's really important, I think, which is adolescence is the loneliest portion of the lifespan. And people are usually surprised by that because they think you've got all your friends, you've got your high school friends, and you spend all your time with people. But while that's true, it's the case that these are often new friendships, and they're friendships that aren't solidly formed, and that you're still figuring these things out. And your best friend today may not be your best friend next week. And that's different than later in the lifespan. And I think just from that perspective, one of the most destructive things we tell teenagers are these are the best years of your life. Physically, we'd all be happy to have our 16-year-old bodies back pretty much, except for the acne. But emotionally, socially, mentally, maybe it was a good period, but on average, actually, it's the least happy period of life. You get happier from then on. But if you think it's supposed to be the best years and you're feeling lonely, that's a double whammy. So even just letting kids know these are not the best years of your life for most kids is helpful. So yes, teenagers are among the loneliest cohort in the country, and they've been doing worse over time. So in the past decade before COVID, rates of depression went up 60%. And it wasn't just that kids are saying they're more depressed, or that it's, there's less stigma, that may be true. But if you look at something like emergency room visits following suicide attempts, those went up by 60%. That was before COVID. The best data we've got since COVID from the Centers for Disease Control says that rates of anxiety and depression have somewhere between tripled and quadrupled. So you take this group that's lonely to begin with, that is getting more and more depressed, you put COVID on top of it, and they're facing a nightmare of sorts. So, loneliness is different from being an introvert or even from being shy. To get to your second question, in that introverts don't mind some time alone. We all need time with each other. Even the introvert gains from spending time interacting with other people. They may find it tiring, they might not always want to do it, but they benefit from it. Our bodies charge up when we see other people. Like we are pack animals right down to our genes and our bones. So we need that interaction. But introverts need less of it. And so the difference is, if your child is happy doing a lot of things, if they're happy doing a lot of things alone, they're probably more of an introvert, and that's fine. And there's been a movement in the last 5 or 10 years to recognize that being an introvert's okay, that our society sort of rewards extroverts and being an extrovert and a people person, but introverts are often deep thinkers, and they're also often observers. So that part, I think, is really fine. And to sort of recognize that and value that in your child. That's a little different from the child who's socially anxious, who wouldn't really mind being with people, but it just makes them tense. And those kids, the more, we can talk more about that, but the more we get them exposed to other kids, the more we get them in social situations, the less anxious they'll be.
Yeah. You make me think of so many of the groups I've worked with in churches or in schools of one of the benefits that I feel is that it's, I'm not sure the right word to use, but sort of outside initiated interaction for the kids. They're like, oh, I don't want to be there, but they did want to be there, and they just needed us to force to sort of really help organize the conversation, to help structure it so that when they're uncomfortable just making random conversation. One of the things that I've try to do is call on kids because it's so hard for them to decide to speak.
Mhm.
But I think of how that might be a support when it's so hard to initiate these relationships on your own.
No, I think that's really right. And I think we're all seeing an example of this, which is how many of people listening here would have ever predicted a year and a half ago that their kids would say, "I can't wait to go back to school," right? And you didn't really want to do it until you realized how much you were going to miss it if you didn't do it at all. And kids are going to have an adjustment going back to school because you're away from something for that long. And you're a ninth grader who was nervous about going to high school. Now you're a 10th grader. That's going to be an adjustment, and people are going to be stressed. But this gets, I guess, to your question about forcing kids to do things. Our best bet is to entice them to do
That's a
things,
better word. That's a
right?
good.
And the kid who is sitting at home and has a friend, kind of, but they don't know if they should do anything. They're not sure what they would do. That's the place where, in a month, when these kids are vaccinated or when we're feeling a little safer, that's the place where you say, "Hey, why don't you invite Mary or Jamie to the women's soccer game this weekend?" And you pick something or you say, "Hey, how about we go there? Would you like to invite a friend?" And you pick something that's enough fun and enough structure that kids aren't going to be afraid to ask someone because it's a perk, not an obligation.
Mhm.
And then you get them together and they're spending time with each other because they need to do that. I mean, I think youth group can be that as well. And the goal is to make it as much so that it doesn't need to be forced as possible. But there'll be, lots of teenagers would rather on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning just lay in bed until 1 p.m. They're not necessarily going to be happiest doing that. Like we're not good as humans, and adults fit this too. What makes us happy in the short term isn't what makes us happy in the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to pick up on social anxiety because I've had a number of parents ask about anxiety, and especially across all the ages, that it just seems to be a daily struggle. And talk to us about anxiety.
Sure. So, we've learned stuff about anxiety over the last 10 or 15 years. One of the things we've learned, and I tell young people that I work with this, is, there's a reason why we're anxious, and even more anxious than we want to be. That in evolutionary times, the person who was a little bit anxious was the person who didn't get eaten by the lion, and maybe even warned all their fellow travelers to not get eaten. But today, what happens is we've got this very sensitive alarm system, and it goes off too much. I describe it as like having the smoke alarm in your kitchen. It's really sensitive, and all you need to do is be boiling some water, and suddenly it's going off, and it's not telling you about smoke. It's a false alarm. What I tell teenagers is, and what I would tell parents is, you want to help teenagers recognize when your anxiety is a false alarm and when it's something you should take seriously. And the false alarms are really important to push back against, because if you don't push back against them and you do something to kind of just get away from the thing that makes you anxious, the next time you go back, you're going to be more anxious. This is not, I'm saying we're learning this in the last 10 or 15 years. This is in some ways nothing more than get back on the horse, after falling off, right? But the flip side is the piece we've learned, which is if you put yourself in situations that make you a little anxious and you see that they go okay, you get less anxious over time. And that's the important part. And to teach your kids that pushing back against anxiety is just like building any muscle, that the more you do it, the easier it'll get. And the first time you do it, it's tough. The other analogy I use is it's like, an overgrown field. First time you walk through it, it's really hard. the 5th time you go through that path, you've trampled it down. And by the 20th time, it's really no big deal. It's exactly, our brains work in exactly the same fashion. So the short answer is push back against the anxiety and give your kid all the support they need. Don't throw them in over their head, but really let them know, and even get them to pay attention to the fact that, yep, you're really afraid of school on a Sunday night, but then by Monday morning at 9:30, you're actually feeling fine. That was a false alarm. It's a good thing you didn't give into it.
And is there, are you noticing any relationship to sort of global anxiety, sort of the anxieties of society right now and the world? And teenagers are so aware and so concerned about the world. So they're carrying this as well. How do those two play?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it moves more into your domain and not just mine, for sure.
I'm getting to Hope. I'm going to ask you a question.
We want our teenagers to be aware of and concerned about the world. You know, in some ways, that idealism and that willingness to see what's wrong and feel angst about it is a very positive human, reaction to really bad situations. We don't want them to get lost in it. We don't want them to have it bring them down and sap their energy. It reminds me of, when you get on an airplane to take a flight and they do the little spiel and they say, if the oxygen masks drop down and you've got small children, put on your own mask first. Because if you don't do that, you can't help anybody else. And so to tell teenagers, yeah, there is a lot going on with the world. I hope you can help do your part to make it a little better over time. It's important to take care of yourself. And that means letting yourself have a good time. That means letting yourself do things that charge your battery up. Because if you don't do that, you're not going to be any good to anybody. That's one thing. My other thought is one of the better antidotes to how messed up the world is having your own small circle, your family, your friends, be as strong and tight as possible. And that's that sense of community and of bonding and connection that can get us through, that got, people through the bombings in London, that got some people through the Holocaust, right? That connection is incredibly powerful, and to maintain that, at all costs.
Yeah, it's interesting. You think we talk sometimes about creating a microcosm of how we would like it to be. That's certainly one of our goals in the church, is to create a community that we would like it the way we would like it to be, or we would hope for the world to be. Right. And especially with youth groups and with youth communities, that they have this ability to be really creative in their community. But it's another layer to it that you add, of that builds resilience if you have it.
I mean, it's, I've read about the London bombing in World War II, which was a horrible, sustained, frightening, terrible kind of event. And there was almost no post-traumatic stress. There was almost no mental health problems. Suicide attempts went down because people really felt like they were in it together. And that sense of, I've got a community and this is really hard, but I've got my people around me that I care about and they care about me. That is where our energy comes from as humans. And the thing that part of the reason I think I like adolescents is they sense that in their bones. Like we, as adults, we're a little bit we're too likely to kind of poo-poo how worried teens are about their peers. But I think the teens actually have it right, which is those relationships that they're learning to form are going to be what's going to matter most in their lives. And so those skills they're developing are crucially important.
So Joe, are there things you're finding with these groups that are especially important that we should be providing to help them have these meaningful relationships that will carry them?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's really two major elements. One is safety. Adolescence is scary. The social part of adolescence is scary. And I describe high school as like, social Darwinian jungle, right? It's survival of the fittest, right? In social terms. And part of that is you never let your guard down. You never show your chinks in your armor because somebody can take advantage of them. And so if you want kids to be able to let their guard down, to be able to see that everybody else has the same chinks in their armor as I do, you have to make it safe. And so the adults really have a role. Like these groups I've decided that I described that happen naturally, there's almost always an adult involved. They're not just kids off by themselves, because that's not quite as safe. Mm-hmm. And the other piece, which comes really naturally to you in your work, is some sense of common values. This program actually is, if anything, patterned on a religious retreat I went to in high school. And one of the hardest pieces to replicate has been the common values that everybody going on that retreat shared. But that's something you can easily, you've got that, right? That's. I mean, you're working. You're always working.
We're working on it.
You're working on it. That comes pretty naturally. And then it's a matter of finding ways to help kids safely recognize how much they have in common. So we do exercises. You were part of this, right? Where we say, if anonymously, if you really knew me, you'd know one thing I'm worried about is, and kids will answer that on a card or on a chat box anonymously or whatever. And then you share them. And then suddenly the kids are all like, whoa, I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Mm-hmm. And that combination of safety and starting to recognize the sort of shared humanity that we all have, that just brings out people's support, their empathy, their desire to connect. It builds bonds, but it also builds character. And I think youth groups are a perfect place to do this. Any place you can bring kids together with some sort of common purpose and some sort of safe structure. It's like you don't just get together ideally and say, let's just all talk about what we think about the world. That's okay, but the quiet, shy kid is going to be afraid to do that. You have to have some structure, like you said, to bring everybody in.
Yeah. How about for, I'm thinking of all the parents watching this, when you talk about safety and you talk about conversation and creating meaningful conversation, we had some questions about, how to get your child to talk and not in a way that's respectful of them, but can be meaningful, and thinking about these same desires, but in the home.
Yeah. So Claudia actually has I don't think she probably mentioned it yesterday, but she has a sort of little saying talking to your kids and your teens, which is time without criticism, which is you want to have periods where you're talking to your teen where you're just zipping it in terms of not just criticism, but advice. That you're going to have a period of time where you're not trying to give them guidance, you're not trying to give them advice, you're not trying to correct things, you're just talking with them. And I don't know about you, but as a parent, that's not actually easy, right? Because you're constantly seeing things and they're imperfect beings and you're constantly seeing the ways they're imperfect. And so, but, would you really want to talk to your best friend if every 2 minutes they were telling you something you could be doing better? How good would your friendship be? So that's one way of making it safe. I mean, there are a lot of kids who are just sort of always ducking because they're always waiting for you really should be working more on your homework, or, if you got some more exercise, you'd actually feel better. Or, did you ever think you're sleeping a little too late? Or, that the YouTube is, you can all imagine your own criticisms or remember your own criticisms you offer. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of safety is respecting kids' limited interest in how much they want to talk. So a kid who might be perfectly happy to have a 3-minute conversation, and you're so thrilled you're having a 3-minute conversation, they don't want to turn it into a 15-minute conversation.
Mhm.
So, hit and run, take your good period of take your good 5 sentences back and forth and enjoy it and move on. Because if you make it easy to get in and out of, your kid will be more likely to want to get into it, again with you. And so that's kind of a piece of it as well. And then the last piece there is respect their timing. We had to learn this with our kids. They come home from school, and back when kids came home from school, and you say, what was your day like? And you get 2-word mumbles, right? Or it was like, it was a day. And you're like, well, okay, but what happened? And what we eventually learned, because even though we're 2 psychologists, our kids taught us a lot. What we eventually learned was they were burned out at that point. They've been with people for 6, 7, 8 hours. They just wanted space. And then what would happen was we'd be getting ready to go to bed at 10:15, and they would come down and start chatting. And at first, my reaction was, I'm sleepy. This is not really the time. But then you kind of realize, no, this is the time where it works for them. And so you work on their schedule. One teen I worked with just complained bitterly that his dad wanted to pencil in times to talk. And he's like, I don't work that way. That sometimes I don't want to talk. So you pick times where they want to talk, you keep it short, and you do it without criticism and advice. You can do the criticism and advice some other time, and they'll want to talk more.
Boy, the time without criticism. And I can remember full conversations in my own brain. Don't say it. Don't say it. Maybe I should say it. Don't say it. Don't say it. And often I ended up saying it, and that wasn't good.
Likewise.
And I can also remember when Maddie, our oldest, said to me after what I thought was such a nice conversation, she said, how was that heart to heart, Mom? Was that long enough for you? And I thought, well, that was generous of her to, but it really reminded me of that when you talk about keeping it short and their amount of time. I want to bring up also a topic on timing, but a serious topic on timing, where one person asked about how, as a parent, what to do and what to say if your child tells you that they're questioning their identity, they're questioning their sexuality, and that really is their timing. That is a hard thing for a child to share with a parent. And if you have any advice for us.
The first bit of advice is, if your child tells you that, you should feel flattered and honored that they trust you, right? That if they tell you when they're 35, maybe not so much, but if they're telling you when they're their teen years, they're trusting you with one of the most vulnerable things they're feeling in their entire world, and not knowing exactly how you're going to react. And that's the most important piece, right? That knowing that if your reaction is not, oh my gosh, my child's having to go through all of this, but rather, whoa, they trust me so much, you're going to react more calmly and in a more positive way than you would otherwise. Obviously, being supportive and letting them know how much you appreciate them sharing that, and that questioning and issues of identity are challenging issues, and they aren't easy things to figure out, and our whole society is still figuring them out. But you're happy to kind of talk with your kid and work with them and think through it, I think is the right way to go. The thing to be careful about is it can be scary as a parent that, we know how much prejudice is out there against kids who are not just, mainstream in terms of sexuality and identity. And And you don't want that fear. And what you don't want is that fear to come across to your child as like disapproval, or like, now my mom is frowning, or now my mom seems really upset. If you feel the fear, you can say, wow, it makes me worried because it's a hard world out there, but that's the world's problem. We'll help you figure this out.
That's the world's problem. We'll help you figure this out. That's a beautiful statement. That's a really beautiful statement. Yeah, and I think that the identity question in general, I think, is such a huge issue for adolescents. You take that word and take it any direction, and they're having to figure out a lot. And maybe that's another way that youth can feel connected to one another, that they're all figuring out some aspect of their identity, of who they are, or their place in the world.
No.
What about a couple other tough issues of substance abuse in the family, and kids that are maybe navigating substance abuse in the family or some form of addiction? Do you have any advice for ways for us to support?
The most important thing there is to be relatively open and transparent. I don't know who said this, but it has stuck with me, that the traumas in our childhood that we know about, that we remember as adults, they're distressing, but we can cope with them. We can get over them. It's the traumas in our childhood that we didn't know about, that we aren't aware of, that were sort of swept under the rug. Those are the ones that stick with us. So
Wait, can you say that one more time?
Sure, I can say it better. The trauma that we were aware of, we can cope with. It's the trauma that we didn't even realize was trauma at the time. That's what's hard to cope with. So, having an alcoholic parent, just to use that as an example, is really hard on kids. But having an alcoholic parent where the other parent says, yeah, your mom or your dad has a real drinking problem, and yeah, you're right, when he or she or they came home and they were smashing things, that was scary for all of us, and that's terrible, and I bet you were terrified. That's so much easier on a kid than the parent who hopes that you didn't hear anything and just acts like everything's fine. Because in that case, you're left questioning your own judgment. You're left trying to sweep things under the rug that really need to be talked about. And so, you can go too far. You don't need to go into, gory detail about what happened in the emergency room, but letting the child know that, yep, there is a problem here, and people have problems, and your dad has a real problem, and we're hoping he can deal with it, but it's terrible for you, and we know that, and nobody wanted that for you, and you shouldn't have to be dealing with this, but you do, and we'll try and help you.
Yeah, I'm hearing an ongoing theme here of honesty.
Yeah.
And just whether it's in a group of peers or in your family, or dealing with your own identity, that the more we can work on that.
And the more authentic and honest we are with each other, the more we can cope with, the more resilient we'll be, the stronger our bonds will be. And that's what's going to get us through it. Whatever it might happen to be, whether it's, coming out as transgender, whether it's dealing with an alcoholic parent, whether it's a kid dealing with an alcohol problem, whether it's social anxiety, or to take it to the extreme, parents worry, is my kid suicidal? Are they thinking of hurting themselves? The answer to that, not the answer, but the right approach to that, is to say, you seem really down. Do you ever think about hurting yourself? that being straightforward with it is never going to give a kid the idea. Kids, the ideas in our society, to a disturbing extent, but having a chance to talk out loud about it, scary as it might be, is a lot less scary for a kid than just having it in the inside of their head bouncing around.
Just hearing you say that makes me think how important it is for us as parents to have a group where we can practice saying something like, do you ever think of hurting yourself? Or just because I remember you were the one who told me that parenting teenagers is the loneliest time for parents, because we're not sitting on the playground chit-chatting about a 2-year-old's tantrum. We have our own child's privacy to worry about, and we respect their privacy, so we can't, and often our friends are their friends' parents.
Yep.
And so the loneliness of a parent of a teenager is something that I'm concerned about, and providing ways for parents to be honest with each other.
And it's so hard. The problems that teens bring to parents are so hard to think through. And you don't know if other parents are doing it. You don't know if you tell another parent what happened in your house last night, if they'll think, oh my God, my house is way worse than that, or if they'll think you're a disaster of a parent, right? It's really hard to know that. And it can go, and sometimes people are kind of disasters as a parent and have no idea. And sometimes parents are fantastic parents and feel like they're disasters, but there's not that communication. And so, yeah, looking for ways and I think your community could do this, looking for ways to let people share things with some degree of anonymity, some degree of understandings of confidentiality, bringing together groups of parents whose kids don't know each other, all those kinds of things. Parents really need that it used to be, we were in smaller communities that were tighter knit. And if nothing else, you had a large extended family that all lived nearby. And so you got to hear and share ideas. And we don't have that now. And we work to kind of make up for it.
Yeah. And we're amateurs. We're doing it out of love, not out of professional training.
I describe parenting teenagers. It is like driving down a snowy road that's windy at night with the headlights off. And you only know that you're going too far to the side when you're halfway in the ditch. And then you try and correct back. And it's just a series of corrections. And that, and then after you've done it a couple of times, you're pretty good at it and you're done. You don't get to do it anymore.
Well, how about a question about strengths, sort of strengths of adolescents that we can really highlight for them and affirm in them that what are their special gifts?
So let me take that in a slightly different way. I think we need to work to build those strengths.
Okay.
Meaning the way that we've structured the world of teenagers these days, they don't have much of a chance to do anything useful for anyone. That, I've had my UVA students describe adolescence as living in a bubble. And the bubble is the walls of your classroom, the walls of your room at home, the internet. Used to be the shopping mall. I'm not sure what even replaces that, but not much else. And the idea is there's very little contact with anything meaningful. And so, and teens need that. 100 years ago, teenagers were helping on the farm. They were rebuilding a car in their backyard. They were doing things that actually were productive. And there's a lot of work to do in the world. There's plenty of ways they can be productive now. It takes us as adults being willing to be a little patient to engage them. But getting young people, it can be volunteering in the community, or it can be, we sort of have a joke in my house that, we've said that parents should have an alarm bell in their head with teenagers, and the alarm bell should go off anytime you're about to do anything at all for your teenager that they could possibly learn to do for themselves. and it could, and then you suddenly realize, well, they could learn to call the dentist and make an appointment. And then I wouldn't have to figure out when their soccer game was. And they could actually walk a mile to the store to pick up the, sweets that they want or whatever. And they could do their own laundry, and they could make a meal once in a while. And the thing about those things is they take some effort on the part of the parents, but that's what gives a kid a sense of accomplishment, of self-esteem. The kid who knows they can take care of themselves and that they can do things in the world, especially if they can do things that are valuable to other people, that volunteer and help out. That's where you get a sense of self-esteem. Otherwise, you're stuck as a 10th grader in a classroom with 300 other kids, probably all from the same socioeconomic group as yourself, all taking the same set of classes, all doing the same 3 sports, and you're supposed to feel unique and special. And that's just a setup.
Wow. I mean, that I love everything you said, because it is so much a part of our conversation right now in the church, because there is a lot of work to do in the church, and there is a lot of work needed, and so many ways that adolescents could be doing the same exact work that all of us are doing
So just this is a hobby horse of mine. So people, some of you have probably seen the play Hamilton or the movie Hamilton. He was, leading one of George Washington's armies before he turned 19. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake before she turned 18 and had done all of the things she had done. And you could go through history, and there's just example after example. There's huge talent, and if anything, adolescents are maturing more quickly now than they were then. There's huge capability. As adults, we sort of run from teenagers. If you see a group of teenagers, 6 or 7, at a restaurant, you don't want to sit at a table near them. We're a little bit intimidated by them. We sort of remember our own adolescent years and how intimidating it could be. And we need to get over our own anxieties there and reach out to them. And as adults, if you reach out in a friendly way without criticism and let them know that you value them, teenagers just eat it up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I see kids in therapy, obviously, and I constantly see kids who are like dragged in. And it's not that I have any magic potion. It's that I take them seriously and really listen to them. And I'm looking for the good and not just the problems. And they're desperate for that. And so if you want to engage the teenagers in your community, in your congregation, engage the adults, because they're the ones who need to be inviting and to do the structuring. That kids do need structure. They're not just going to come in and know how to do things. Mm-hmm. But I was at a radio station doing an interview 2 years ago where the station manager was complaining that he hired a 20-year-old and said, "Could you sweep the floor?" And the kid said, "Can you show me how?" That's not a recipe for self-esteem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you and I are both lovers of Outward Bound, but one of the things that I really love and admire about Outward Bound and other organizations, so many who do this kind of important work, is that adolescents will translate having accomplished one thing into all other parts of their lives. They don't have to have accomplished mastery in everything. But self-esteem is, I think, sort of like anxiety. It can grow and find nooks and crannies. If it's built up in one place, they can take that and they can move it over here to someplace else.
That's such a good observation that, everything is new to teenagers. And it's one of the fun things about that age. But what it means is if they have a new experience that's really hard and challenging, and they master it, they quickly generalize. They quickly say, "Okay, I can do things." Uh-huh. And they generalize from the bad too. But so we want to give them those good experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I have this is just so helpful. I have 2 last questions.
Okay.
And well, maybe 3. I'm going to ask one little question, then I've got 2 more kind of closing questions. So and this is connected to autonomy and agency and all these things. And this is the question of how much freedom to give when you're scared as a parent. And it seems to just get harder and harder to
Yep,
send them out the
yep.
door by themselves. You can pick any area, social
Yeah.
media, anything.
Yep. So the way I think about it is a 14-year-old is ideally on a glide path toward being an 18-year-old who's off in college or wherever calling their own shots. And your goal as a parent is to have that path from 14 to 18 be a steady, upward, movement in terms of responsibility on the part of the kid. But the idea I think that's crucial is that responsibility is that autonomy comes with responsibility, and that the more responsible a kid is, the more autonomous they should be. So that there are 14-year-olds who can and should be able to go out and move about the world on a Friday night and have their parents trust them in terms of basically where they're going and what they're doing without very much in the way of check-ins. There are 17-and-a-half-year-olds that aren't there. And so as a parent, you both want to titrate it to, to balance it to how responsible your kid is, but you want to tell your kid that you're doing that the more responsible I see you being, the more freedom you're going to get. And obviously the reverse. So show me that you're doing your chores, show me that you're not getting in trouble, show me that you're getting good grades, and we'll just open up everything, to you. If you're really struggling with those things as your parent, it's our job to kind of say, no, we want to keep the guardrails there. The only exception, the exception would be with addictive kinds of things. So, and I guess I put social media there, meaning I don't think it's probably ever very good for a teenager to be, I don't think it's ever good for a teenager to be at 3 a.m. on their phone.
Mhm.
Now, are there teenagers who are showing they can handle that freedom to decide when they turn it off? Sure. But it's so addictive that I would lean in the direction of saying, let's keep the restrictions on a bit. Now, recognizing that if you're getting them on that glide path to college or wherever at 18, you have to take the restrictions off and you have to give them practice. And I guess the only other thing I want to say is you have to let them screw up. That I tell parents all the time when their kids screw up in high school, now is when you want them to screw up. The stakes are pretty low. You don't want them to screw up when they're applying, to college, or when they're applying for their first job, or when they've got their first job and they're suddenly realizing, that the costs are really huge. You want them having the experience now.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that just the reminder that it's messy, that the balance of freedom and responsibility, we think it's going to go chink, 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 and it's so messy.
And kids learn from their mistakes.
Mhm.
Arguably, a lot of kids only learn from their mistakes. That, as humans, we're not very good at learning because somebody just tells us something. Like, we need to sort of see it and experience it to really learn it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, my last question, we just got about 6 more minutes. And there are 2 questions, and you can take whatever you want. One is, when you think of mental well-being for adolescents, what haven't we heard that you want us to hear tonight? And connected to that is, if you were in charge, what would you have religious communities do? What would you have us do that could really help the world, help adolescents? And you've touched on some things, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think you have an awesome opportunity in that if adolescence is the loneliest period of lifespan, and COVID has made it, 4 times lonelier still, you have a natural place where people come together. And your challenge is to listen super closely to adolescents to find ways of bringing them together that as many of them as possible are going to want to take up, right? That the challenge is not just to work with the 15 kids who come to youth group out of the 150 in your congregation. It's to figure out what kinds of ways can you entice more and more of those kids to get engaged. And then once they're engaged, how can you make that a positive experience for them? And I think there's sort of the simple answer is you have them do good activities that are fun and safe and easy and structured and not too scary. But I think the real answer is if you can do some of that, their energy with each other will carry you. That adolescents have this drive to connect with their peers. And it's like I started by saying, it's wired into us and it's there because it belongs there. But let's take advantage of it. And so instead of the kid who's desperate to be out with their peers, and so they go out drinking on a Friday night, take advantage, give them chances to interact and just have fun and connect and talk and share in safe ways with one another. And you're kind of introducing them to the idea of community, that, that for the adolescent, the community will partly be the adults. And I know Claudia talked a little bit about that yesterday, and I agree with that. But their real community is each other. And for them to get a chance to start to experience that is they're at the first age where they can start to have real, true adult-like relationships. And you are kind of in the honored position of being able to shepherd them through those. And I think taking advantage of that is probably the single best thing you can do.
Yeah, it's an honor. It is. It's an honor to do it.
Yeah.
Anything you think of that you wish we didn't ask?
Not off the top of my head. It's not always easy. Meaning to work with adolescents also means having some patience, that they'll be teenagers. I still remember our middle child, you may remember this, ditching a commitment she made to do something with a group of yours, back when she was 14 or 15. And you were very clear that that wasn't great, but you also were like still welcoming her back. And I think we have to have that tolerance for the fact that they're works in progress. We're all works in progress, but they're especially works in progress, and they're not finished. And as parents, we fret that our 17-year-olds still have all these flaws. And of course they do, because they still will have them when they're 57, but they're only 17. And they're still figuring it out. And so we have to be willing to roll with the punches. I guess that would be my last kind of thought. If we do that, it's worth it, that they pay us back. And they so appreciate an adult who's both willing to recognize their maturity, but also their not yet maturity.
Yeah, the word in our world is grace, that it's and we say it a lot in our church, and that just to have grace for each other. And I didn't get a chance to ask this, but I have 1 minute with you. And that is, for me, the role, even in the broadest sense of the term, of a sense of the spiritual life, a sense of mystery, a sense of wonder, that they feel that they can be a part of, to me, is an important part of their inner strength.
Yeah. I mean, and it's why I work with teenagers. The show, The Wonder Years, was the wonder years, right? That there's this openness to experience, this willingness to take chances, this willingness to fall on your face and get back up, and this sort of life force, this life energy that we see so strongly in adolescence, and that we sometimes lose as adults, and we'd be better off not losing. That adolescents can actually teach us a lot in that regard, if we're willing to listen.
That's why I love them. That's why I love them. Thank you so much, Joe. I have loved talking with you, and I know that we're going to have some follow-up conversations follow-up discussions with parents, and we really, really appreciate your time and sharing with us, spending it with us. So thank you. And I'd like to close with prayer. Let us pray. Loving God, thank you. Thank you for the chance to focus our hearts and minds on the young people in our lives, in our families, in our church, in our city, in our world. They are so precious and so valuable. Help us to find a million ways to care for them and love them and build structures of compassion for them. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you,
Janet.
Joe.
Thank you, Janet. It was an honor to get to do this with you. It was great fun.
It was great fun. And thank you all. And we'll keep talking.